Chapter 3. Piranhas 3. After Kaida rescued Jackson and the other egg thieves and brought them back to the Milky Way, sweat covered Jackson's body. The captain stood on the bridge of the Manticore, staring into the cold expanse of space. His fingers brushed the cool, slick surface of the console, grounding him as he reviewed the latest coordinates from Andromeda. Despite the familiarity, the touch felt foreign, adding to the unease gnawing at his stomach. The retrieval of dragon eggs from parallel universes seemed like an impossible task, especially without the precise coordinates the quantum Dreamweaver required. Their last astral journey had been fraught with uncertainty, and Jackson still didn't fully grasp the constellations of these other realms. The prospect of facing the celestial architects again, with their cryptic demands, made his throat tighten. He was at odds with the notion of universes layered in dimensions he could barely comprehend. Jackson chewed on his cyborg knuckle unconsciously, a nervous habit he thought he'd left behind at the Novatech Consortium all those decades ago, when he had two biological hands. The sharp taste of iron and the faint sting kept him tethered to reality. When Annika's mental health had stabilized, because they'd returned to their own universe. She had healed both his and Mafditi's burns. That didn't calm the tension in his muscles, though. His thoughts drifted back to the ultimatum issued by the celestial architects. They had warned that if he and his crew didn't bring them dragon eggs, it would lead to dire consequences. He wondered what the Church of the Celestial Body knew. If the celestial architects couldn't provide answers about the coordinate dilemma, another visit to the Sol System's Oort cloud might be necessary. The Oort cloud, with its desolate silence and vast emptiness, seemed almost preferable to the unknowns they faced now. Seer's voice cut through his thoughts.
Ready for this.
She stood beside him, her dark green eyes fixed on the starry expanse outside. Her hand on his arm was warm, anchoring him to the present. We have no choice, Jackson replied with a steady voice despite the dryness in his mouth. The Triangulum and the Milky Way depend on us. He forced a smile. The crew had discussed the dilemma, agreeing to gather as many eggs as possible from their universe before venturing into others. Kaida entered the bridge. Her movements were precise and deliberate, and her presence was as calm as usual.
Annika is in the quantum Dreamweaver, ready to visualize the coordinates on your word.
Let's bring these dragon eggs home. Jackson's words tasted like sand in his mouth. With a deep breath, he gave the command. The ship darkened, and his vision blurred. The sudden shift made his stomach lurch, and he gripped the console to steady himself. When the lights flickered on again, sweat beaded on his forehead. Seer was crouched on the floor, her face pale. "Are you okay?" Jackson asked, worried.
Yes, just dizzy. I'll be fine. Just caught me off guard.
"Check on your kids," Jackson suggested. "They might need you." Seer nodded and hurried off the bridge. Her concern for her children was a constant undercurrent, something Jackson understood all too well. He watched her go, feeling a pang of empathy for her situation. Kaida scanned the holographic display of the volcanic planet, filling the central viewport.
Atmosphere analysis complete. High levels of sulfur dioxide and carbon monoxide. Surface temperatures range from 700 to 1000 degrees Kelvin. Gravity's 1.2 times that of Earth's.
Her voice was clinical, detached, but Jackson could sense the underlying tension. Jackson nodded, his mouth dry. Not the friendliest place. Any signs of life?
No.
Kaida said flatly.
No biological life. The environment is too hostile for most forms of life as we know it.
He nodded, though his hands felt clammy. The data confirmed his fears. All right, who's taking the Dreamweaver down there? Kaida's black eyes narrowed.
I thought some shapeshifters could handle it, but I'm worried about their safety.
Bring the shapeshifters to the bridge, Jackson ordered. Even Robert and Penny. They've had enough practice. Kaida raised an eyebrow.
They're still new at this.
They're all new, Kaida. Our Anubak refused to come. They had to stay with their families. His voice was a notch tighter, reflecting his frustration. But Robert and Penny are always shifting for fun. They've been practicing since we left Microxus. Teenagers they may be, but they're not children. Kaida looked unconvinced, but complied, calling the shapeshifters to the bridge. Her reluctance was obvious, and Jackson felt a flicker of guilt for pushing them so hard. He reminded himself that the stakes were too high for hesitation. When everyone arrived, Jackson stood at the head of the group, the harsh, unforgiving data about the planet scrolling beside him. We've got a tough mission ahead. The environment down there is hostile. Extreme heat, toxic gases, unstable terrain. What forms will work best? Morel, her pale pink face thoughtful, spoke first.
A molten core entity. We'd be tough, heat-resistant, and fluid enough to move through molten rock.
Kaida nodded.
That's imaginative. What about carrying the eggs?
Morel hesitated.
I'll figure it out when we get there. The challenge is how to maintain our forms while handling the eggs.
Robert, full of nervous energy, shifted on his feet.
Basalt golems. Tough as rocks, but agile. We could handle collapses or debris and carry the eggs. We'd be able to maneuver through the terrain without too much trouble.
Jackson's concern deepened. What if you melt the Dreamweaver?
We'll test it first.
Robert said.
The Dreamweaver must handle our forms without becoming damaged.
Penny nodded frantically, her blonde hair tied back tightly.
Silicate spiders, webbing could stabilize loose rocks and cross gaps. We need to navigate the terrain and secure the eggs without risking them.
Damien rubbed his chin, his navy-skinned face thoughtful.
A liquid metal entity. We need to flow over surfaces and adapt quickly. This form could help us deal with toxic gases and move through different environments without being held back by physical limits.
Jackson nodded, appreciating the thoughtfulness of their choices. And you, Brenna. Brenna's calm presence belied the tension in the room. Her pale blue skin seemed almost to glow under the bridge's lights.
Thermal-plated armadillo. Reflect heat, disperse it, and burrow for safety. We need forms that can withstand the environment and protect us from the extreme conditions.
But an armadillo couldn't breathe the atmosphere, could it? Jackson said warily.
There's no biological life down there.
Kaida nodded at the diagram, which portrayed an aerial view of the landscape.
We need forms that don't rely on traditional biological functions.
Brenna's cheeks flushed a darker shade of blue.
You're right. I'll copy Damien's idea. We need versatility.
Jackson's ribcage felt too tight, and he sucked in each ragged breath. The first thing we need to do is see if a magma golem can sit inside the Dreamweaver without melting it. His stomach churned as he twisted his comm band around his wrist. Dean, from Earth's moon colony Delta 7, looked solemn, his past losses clear in his gaze.
I'm thinking a magma prowler. We need something that's agile enough to navigate and tough enough to endure. If things get rough, we'd need to climb out or find a safe spot quickly.
Jackson gave each of them a serious look, realizing how important the mission was. Remember, this isn't just about collecting dragon eggs. Your safety is paramount. Adapt as needed, stay in contact, and if things go south, we'll get you out. The shapeshifters exchanged determined glances. Their jaws were clenched, but their hands trembled, and Jackson felt the same tremor running through him.
We'll try our best, Captain,
Damien said. Jackson and Kaida led the team of shapeshifters through the corridors of the Manticore. Panels of silvery alloy lined the walls of the corridor, glistening under the artificial lighting. Jackson's gaze swept over the familiar environment, taking in the digital displays and status monitors embedded along the passage. As they approached the elevator, Kaida tapped a sequence into the control pad, and the doors slid open with a hiss. Jackson keyed in their destination, his fingers brushing against the touch-sensitive panel. The elevator hummed to life, descending smoothly toward the hangar. He exchanged a glance with Kaida, noting the steely determination in her eyes. When the doors opened again, the quantum Dreamweaver stood in the center of the hangar. Its surface shimmered gold, the intricate hieroglyphs reflecting the soft glow of the overhead lights. Remember, safety first, Jackson said. Test your forms inside the Dreamweaver and ensure there's no damage. We must know whether it can withstand the conditions you'll face. The shapeshifters nodded. When the shell opened, the petals resembled those of a golden rose opening to the sun. Every petal became a ramp. The shifters walked up one of those ramps and filed inside. Jackson and Kaida remained outside, their eyes fixed on the Dreamweaver's entryway. Jackson's fingers drummed lightly against his side, a subconscious rhythm that mirrored the pulse of his thoughts. After an anxious 5 minutes, the shapeshifters grinned as they exited the craft again. Brenna explained what had happened. Inside the quantum Dreamweaver, Morel's form had shifted into that of a molten core entity. Her body had become a swirling mass of magma, glowing with an intense, fiery light. Robert's form had solidified into a basalt golem. His skin had transformed into rough, dark stone, his limbs taking on the appearance of jagged rocks. He explained to Jackson and Kaida that his golem's movements had been slow but deliberate, the heavy stone making a dull, grinding sound with each step. Robert laughed as he told them about his girlfriend. Penny's form had rippled as she morphed into a silicate spider, her body elongated, sprouting multiple legs that gleamed with a crystalline sheen. The spider's movements had been swift and agile, her webbing forming intricate patterns in the air as she tested her abilities. Damien had become a liquid metal entity. His body had shimmered with a metallic luster. The liquid metal had adapted to the contours of the Dreamweaver's interior, reflecting its golden light. Brenna and Dean had transformed into a molten golem and a magma prowler, respectively. Brenna's thermal-plated exterior glowed with a fierce intensity.
Everything's fine, Captain,
Morell said.
The Dreamweaver's interior was holding up perfectly. Nothing affected it at all.
The test had been successful, the quantum Dreamweaver proving its resilience against the shapeshifter's extreme forms. Jackson's shoulders eased, a slow breath escaping his lips. He exchanged a glance with Kaida. "Great work, everyone," Jackson said, his voice carrying a note of genuine appreciation. "Return to the QD and prepare for the mission. I've transferred the exact coordinates to your comm bands. Check them first, then take them off and transform. We won't be able to communicate once you're there, so good luck and be careful. You've got a lot of work ahead, but this is a good start." The quantum Dreamweaver hovered over Pyranus 3, its landing struts buried in the still cooling lava. The shapeshifters moved methodically, testing the resilience of their forms against the planet's fierce conditions. Above, the Manticore maintained its vigilant orbit, its sensors locked onto the Dreamweaver and its crew. Jackson monitored the feed from the command deck, his eyes darting between the live footage and the data streams. "How's the QD hull?" he asked, addressing Kaida at the sensor station. Kaida glanced at her monitor.
Holding steady. The Dreamweaver's shield is absorbing all the heat. No signs of stress on the structure.
Below, the shapeshifters continued their assessments. Morell's molten form glided over the landscape, her glowing body a different hue to the seething lava. Damien, in his molten metal state, tested the limits of his transformation, the intense heat warping his metallic surface slightly before it stabilized. Down below, the shapeshifters continued their somber task. Morell glided across the churning terrain in her molten form, her radiant glow in stark contrast to the bubbling lava beneath. Damien, transformed into a reflective pool of molten metal, tested his endurance against the relentless heat, contorting and reshaping his surface in defiance of the fiery inferno. Meanwhile, Dean had taken on the guise of a sleek transport vehicle, navigating with precision through the hazardous landscape. His reinforced hull allowed him to glide over the searing magma flows as he extended mechanical arms to delicately retrieve the fragile dragon eggs. Robert, now a formidable multi-limbed behemoth, carefully secured each egg in an armored hold with his powerful appendages, constantly scanning for any potential threats or damages. With his towering mass and deliberate movements, Robert led the way through the molten sea, while Penny darted around his legs and the surging lava. Her serpentine body moved with fluid grace, her shimmering scales glistening in the intense heat as she acted as a guide for Robert and Dean, directing them towards safer paths. In her arachnid form, Brenna scaled across the volatile terrain with surprising agility. Her delicate sensors probed the ground for safe spots and avoided unstable patches of magma as she wove a protective web around each transferred egg. Her multiple eyes scanned for danger while her spinnerets released a cooling agent to shield the eggs from the scorching environment. The dragon eggs, now safely cocooned in Brenna's webbing, emitted a faint glow amidst the molten landscape. Jackson could only watch as their mission's limitations restrained him. Damien absorbed each egg into his liquid metal form before passing them to a pouch on Brenna's spider-like body, his head now a grotesque and shimmering mound of metal. Jackson longed for the ability to communicate, but their lack of comm bands and mouths made it impossible. 4 of them entered the golden orb. But as Damien and Morell slithered towards the QD, a sudden tremor shook the ground. The lava shifted violently, sending up a spray of molten rock. The Dreamweaver lurched, its landing struts sinking deeper into the unstable ground. Status report. Jackson barked, gripping the edge of his console. Kaida tapped at her controls.
Seismic activity detected. The ground's becoming unstable.
The screen showed the shapeshifters scrambling to maintain their footing. Beneath them, the lava surged, forming a turbulent ocean of molten rock. The Dreamweaver's engines roared as it tried to lift off, but the shifting ground kept it tethered. Morel and Damien, now resembling molten creatures with 4 legs, made their way towards the craft, but the ground split open between them and the Dreamweaver. A river of molten rock cut off their path. The air shimmered with heat, distorting the view from the Manticore. Brenna, Robert, Dean, and Penny, already inside the Dreamweaver, looked out in horror as their comrades struggled against the shifting lava. Morel's molten form flickered, her glow dimming as she fought to maintain her shape.
We have to get them out of there.
Kaida said in a tense voice.
We can't leave them behind.
The seismic activity showed no signs of abating. Jackson's pulse picked up as he searched for a solution. Dean, you've practiced this, Jackson said through his comm band. Activate the emergency retrieval protocol, he commanded. We need to get the Dreamweaver airborne. The Dreamweaver's engines flared, lifting it off the ground in a burst of energy. The craft wobbled, its struts scraping against the shifting rock. Morel and Damien morphed into shimmering bipeds and reached out towards the Dreamweaver. Extend the landing struts, Jackson ordered. Give them something to grab onto. The Dreamweaver's landing struts extended towards the struggling shapeshifters. Morel grabbed onto one strut, her molten form stabilizing as she pulled herself up. Damien reached out as well, but the ground gave way beneath him, a torrent of lava sweeping him off his feet.
Damien,
Penny cried from within the QD. The crew on the Manticore and QD watched in stunned silence as Damien's form was swallowed by the molten rock, his silver glow disappearing beneath the surface. Retract the struts, Jackson shouted. Get Morel on board, now. As the struts retracted, the Dreamweaver pulled Morel up and into its embrace. The golden orb disappeared as it teleported. Hopefully into the Manticore's hangar bay, Jackson thought. Kaida stared at the monitor, her face pale.
Damien's signal. It's gone.
Jackson closed his eyes briefly, a wave of grief washing over him. I must find Annika now and locate him via astral projection.